Welcome to Marney Reid Presents Connect to Develop, where we provide insight from healthcare leaders on the hottest topics and trends. I'm super excited to introduce you to two amazing leaders. Erika DeLeon is a healthcare executive focused on building high-performing teams and transforming operations to drive growth. Hi, Erika.
Hey, Marnie. It's such a pleasure to be on the Connect to Develop podcast. First and foremost, just thank you for the invitation, and I look forward to today's discussion.
Absolutely. And Maryrose Roberts, Southeast Director at VanEck Funds with a decade experience in the financial industry. Hi, Maryrose.
Hey, Marnie. Thanks for having me back on the podcast. Great to be with you and Erika this morning.
Today we'll be talking about developing and or demonstrating your leadership skills during a time of organizational change. Erika, if diamonds are made from pressure and heroes emerge during times of crisis, how do leaders emerge or thrive during a time of organizational change?
Such a great question, Marnie. When it comes to leadership development and organizational change, a lot boils down to perspective, specifically how the leader views the opportunity at hand. It's so easy to feel overwhelmed. But what I would say is that a leader's ability to shift their mindset and see a change as a chance for growth is key. There's a couple of key questions. If I were to personalize this to myself and say, okay, here's an opportunity to thrive and grow in this situation of change, here's some thought-provoking questions that I would ask. One, how can I provide or increase clarity? When things are shifting, people are confused, uncertain. It's critical to provide clear direction so that the team essentially knows, where we're heading. Second, how can I continue to cast vision? This is really, really important because you want to rally people around that vision. Reaffirming the vision reminds the team of why the change matters and how it aligns with the company's greater goals and vision and mission long term. Third question I would ask myself is, how do I paint a clear path of how everyone plays into that vision? This one's really important to me specifically because I'm super passionate about building teams and connecting people to their why and how they play a part of that vision. And so helping each team member understand that, and whether that's a new role or an evolved role, is just such a great opportunity for engagement. The fourth question I would think through is, how do I foster empathy and relate with my team? At the end of the day, I would be in the same position and have the same questions and have the same concerns. So this is an opportunity as a leader to relate, to listen, to create a culture of empathy so that the team feels understood. And then lastly, the last question I would ask myself is, how do I level set around new or changed expectations? This is a given. Expectations are going to change when there's a change in organization. And so being as transparent as possible and providing the resources and the tools for your team will help them thrive through the change.
I love all of that. Maryrose, as someone who went from individual contributor to a huge promotion and then mentoring people who are either directly or indirectly under you, how can you respond to any of those questions as someone who maybe saw some leaders that demonstrated things like that? And then when you got into those shoes, you had to be that leader.
Yeah, I loved Erika's first point was change is all about perspective. That's one of the biggest things in preparing for our discussion today that I kept coming back to as well. As we approach change, I really think of the two A's in my approach to it, and that would be attitude and assumptions. Oftentimes, your attitude is going to control the outcome of these major changes that are being, if you're an individual contributor, being placed in your lap. And if you're the leader in helping make these decisions, what is your attitude going to be as you approach your team? On the other side of that, assumptions. We have all been in an organization where the whispers of change are going on and a big game of telephone can ensue and things can get very much blown out of proportion and completely incorrect from what the actual change is going to be. So I think when I view change, those two things are what I really try to control in this situation as an individual contributor when the change is out of my hands. And then additionally, how I've approached it when I've had big promotions, I think really observing people that have done it well when they have made that same move from you in your organization can be very helpful. I was very fortunate. I've got to see a lot of my colleagues make the same transition I did a number of years ago. And some of them did it very successfully, and some had a lot of failures within that first 1 to 2 years. So I think mimicking the practices that you found success from peers and avoiding those that led to failure.
That makes total sense. So, can you discuss the various levels of change that might affect an individual contributor, as you alluded to earlier, or team leaders and best practices, that you saw that you implemented? And even if I dare say, could we maybe even high level talk about some of the failures so that people understand what not to do?
Sure. So a few that came to mind were obviously a leadership change that impacts people's day to day. If your direct report or over them changes, that is something that's materially going to change your day. I realize that those are changes and enhancements going on all the time. I think when that happens, a good way to approach it is communication with that leadership change. Try and be proactive of reaching out to get an engagement with them early on, get on their calendar and see what their vision is as they get into their role and try and implement the vision that they have. A couple other things that stood out are annual key performance indicators and goals. That's something that is ever flowing within the business world, despite what industry you're in, and can be somewhat frustrating to individual contributors when, per se, you had a great year prior and they want to build on that success and it seems unattainable at the beginning. Some practices I've done in that is really breaking it down day by day, week by week, month by month to make that goal seem more consumable. I would also add some major life changes can happen for you, and that is going to affect your work. Personally, I'm getting ready to have my first baby. So, looking at how I can prepare best moving into that transition and how it affects my work. What one of the things I'm doing right now to help with that change is I'm doing a lot of planning past my maternity leave to set me up for success when I come back, doing a lot of the little administrative things that I know I will be overwhelmed with the big picture things when I come back. So taking care of those little things for me later. And then last one I thought of, Marnie, was a structural change. I have never personally experienced this, but I have seen this within my organization where certain departments swapped out under who potentially is their report or what they are going to now be assimilating up to. Again, I think that comes back to the communication. Try and understand what that leader's vision was and try and understand why the organization made that move as an individual contributor. Again, I would go back to Erika's comments in her initial question with as the leader, transparency, clear vision is the best thing that you can offer your team in these times.
Erika, as someone who has two beautiful children and who also has managed teams where people are going in and out of not even just maternity, paternity, but say big vacations or things like that. As a leader, how do you suggest that people who are getting ready for an adjustment like this? I love that Maryrose is doing all that, annoying, boring administrative things so that when she comes back, she doesn't have to do that plus catch up with all of her clients and immediately hit the road, hitting her quota. So what else do you recommend to our listeners out there, Erika?
I love that Maryrose is doing so much planning. It makes an incredible difference. So plan, plan, plan. I love being able to have, short term, midterm, long term vision of my calendar for the year. And my ability, the evolution of my doing that, when I first started, there was a lot of pockets that I felt, I didn't quite map out in the year. And then I realized the next year I'd put that into a goal. Like I wanted to be able to clearly see quarter 1, quarter 2, quarter 3, quarter 4. What did that look like for me as a professional, me as a mother, me as a wife, and what did that look like when it was merged together? And the more that you can create that picture, and things are going to come up. You can't plan everything, but we know our routines for the most part. We know what those cycles corporately look like in terms of the corporate calendar. And so if you can kind of create short-term and long-term vision around what that is, you can plan around that. And so I would say to the listeners, plan as much as possible. Those administrative tasks that Maryrose talked about, they're not always the most fun, but the more that you invest in creating your roadmap for the year, it's going to serve you well.
I would just add on to what Erika said. Somebody early on in my career, and it's probably a famous quote from somebody, but they shared with me that very successful people don't plan in days and weeks, they plan in months and years. And ultimately, that's what corporations and businesses are doing. And it serves you well in your personal life to reflect that. So you're not being pulled into different things last minute has been my experience. And I think that's what Erika was sharing as well.
Love that quote, whether it was an actual quote or just something that one of your leaders said. Erika, why do people innately fear change? Especially when we know that the only thing in life that is constant besides death, not to be morbid here, taxes, if you're, above board, is change. So can you give us some ways that we can acknowledge when we start to get that innate anxiety when we see hear about the murmurings of change and stuff, and what you can do to reprogram. I think it was Maryrose earlier that said, embrace the change. There's a reason they're doing it. It's all great and well to do that, but can you give us some actionable ideas on what people can do to identify the anxiety and then also, address the change and reframe our mindset?
Yes, absolutely. I would say that the first thing to acknowledge is that the feeling of fear is normal. It is a natural human response. And I think sometimes we can wrestle with the fact that we're having the reaction of fear. And so having that fear is a normal response. And so what truly matters is how we react beyond that initial fear. I think of, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? Where we're instinctively wired to assess our risk. And so our mind immediately is going to what is this? What does this bring up in terms of risk? I recently came across a quote that I shared on my social media from John Maxwell, and it's really stuck with me. What would you do if fear was possible, but you knew it would give you a positive return? I'm going to repeat that. What would you do if failure was possible, but you knew it would give you a positive return? And like I said, I've been sitting with that quote, and this actually just happened a couple of weeks ago. So it's a right on time question. And it got me thinking about the times we hold ourselves back because of the fear of failure. Even if we know that deep down that taking the risk would lead to meaningful growth. And so I would reposition that fear. First, acknowledge it, know that it's a normal reaction, and spend some time really thinking through, what if instead of avoiding those opportunities, you leaned into them with confidence, and then recognizing that the potential rewards could far outweigh the risks. And when you spend some time mapping that out, whether you do your pros and your cons, but just really kind of sitting with that, I think we'll develop that muscle over time that you can lean into that space of fear and convert that into courage.
Are people in the face of change, especially when it's change being put upon you, like by an organization and stuff, are people feeling that they are going to fail, or do they feel like leadership is going to fail them? I love the concept of, addressing and not fearing failure, but what do you do when you feel like your leaders are failing you?
That's a good question, Marnie. It's there's a mix of emotions that I think one would go through, and I can relate to that space because I've been in it myself. And one of the key things that someone said to me along the line of my career is assume good intention. And that was probably about 5-6 years ago that someone said that to me. And so when there is a space of ambiguity or unclarity, and I don't have all the answers, I do my best to try to assume the best intention, that is of my peers, of my leaders, because we don't often have all the facts and we don't know all of the parameters that are around us. And so that's been really anchoring for me in the moments where I am questioning or feeling like my leadership is failing me. I would also say that knowing that you can only control what you can control. You have a sphere of influence, you have a measure of influence. And if you face that opportunity with knowing, okay, I might not understand everything that's going on around me, but I do have a measure of influence that I can impart to those around me. That's helped me, Marnie, in similar situations.
Erika, I love the aspect of good intentions. Marnie, maybe just to add here, one thing I would do in this situation along the lines of Erica's recommendation was replay the tape. If you are afraid of the fact that management and leadership might be failing me, let's look back at my tenure there. Have I felt this before? What have their intentions and their execution been in the past for change? And I know that is not the most reassuring thing, but it can put some of that anxiety at ease. They've made good decisions in the past. This has been positive for the company in the past. This has been positive for me in the past. That's the same leadership and thought process that went into making this decision. And then one recommendation I would say on the opposite side of that is don't go down the commiseration trail. Don't start to get on the bandwagon with other team members of this negativity pipeline of all the bad things that can happen or all the failures that have happened. Try in these moments of change to be very agnostic from those conversations, in my personal experience.
I love both of those responses. And I especially love the whole looking back at the data points. Has leadership failed before? No. Have we been freaked out about some things that have happened, prior to this? Yes. But guess what? It worked out by and large. So, Maryrose, what are things that you have first seen and then yourself done to help your team get through? You mentioned not jumping on the bandwagon of the commiseration trail. So I have to assume that you've seen that before. What have you done to either maybe step in and quiet the noise, or simply have you just gone through self-preservation tactics at that point?
Yes, I can speak from some personal experience on that. I just find that is not helpful to the situation. Going down the negative path with your colleagues typically does not help the situation for your personal anxiety or for how you're going to roll out this change professionally. A couple things that I reflected on in this question of my personal action moving forward. I think one, if you are a leader, maybe separate from the person making the announcement of this. So say you're one layer down, but then you have a team that's all affected by it. I think reaching out to each member of your team individually and taking time to really reassure them, understand what their anxieties are about the change, understand where they view themselves in this change. I've had leaders do that in the past when we've gone through periods of change, and it really meant a lot to me as an individual contributor. I think it speaks very loud volumes of the leader that reaches out to their individual team members for that. As an individual contributor, one thing is, what did we do well before the change? What can I carry over into this change of my processes and my approach with my clients that we did really well that I think is going to accelerate and benefit this change? Erica hit on this very early on, but try and understand the perspective of leadership for making this decision. They probably did not take it lightly, and they are expecting some type of positivity to derive from this change. So try and understand their perspective. Again, going back to the empathy as the individual contributor of how I can be a bit of positive influence in this change. How can this change optimize or benefit me? Ultimately, this is a profession. I know passion is a big piece of it, but can I potentially increase my income? Can I potentially have a next step in my career with this change? Can I potentially learn a new skill from this change? And then how I've done this as an actual antidote. Recently, we are going through a change at my firm in terms of our territory coverage. And one thing that I really wanted to address was how I spent my time with our clients throughout my territory. And this change, one of the biggest reasons for the change was the acceleration of data and a new team within our organization. And it really allowed me to scientifically and take a great look at the opportunity from a data perspective instead of my past where it was a little bit more abstract. So I think you can often find the positivities and implement the things that leadership is giving to you, the resources they are giving to you to make a more impactful, efficient change moving forward.
Great, great responses. Erika, we talked a little bit about transparency earlier on. Can you give examples of great leadership transparency throughout the course of change where they gave enough, to quiet the fears, so to speak, or whatnot, but they didn't give so much because, let's be honest, they're thinking years and years in advance. And then conversely, could you maybe give an illustrative example of what a lack of transparency could look like that could maybe over incite some of those negative whisperings and, telephone calls?
I'm going to start with the latter, Marnie. I always think if you don't provide clarity to your team is going to move forward with their own perceptions, their own understanding, and they're going to act on that. And so communication is, it's an anchor, I would say, just in the midst of change, as a leadership, style, as a person, just as a person of influence. The more that you can communicate appropriately, to your point, there are aspects that you can't openly or broadly communicate to the team, or it's a matter of timing. But be as transparent as you possibly can with those around you, and validate their role to the change, to the why. Because I think if you can do those two things, if you can communicate and give them what they need in the moment, you're meeting them where they are, you're providing relief to any potential questions or anxiety, and you're giving them a sense of purpose and that they matter. And so I would say those two things are really, really key. If you don't do that, then people are going to operate under assumption, and that's when you have a lot of the things that evolve in gossip, or just things start to stew that keeps you off the purpose of what you're trying to do day in, day out, and really gets folks off track.
So, as I had said before, I've been in organizations where they've been acquired. Each time, obviously, it was a great thing for the overall business. At the time, it was a little bit scary. And so there's always that attrition, right, that comes with change. And maybe sometimes that attrition is a good thing because it's people who probably haven't been on the right bus, so to speak, for a while. Can each of you give very actionable tips for people who are individual contributors out there and maybe they want to use this change as an opportunity to showcase to leadership that they're ready for that next step? And so not even just being a leader in terms of, how people view you, but then getting that promotion. So let's start with Maryrose. Can you give us some actionable items on what an individual contributor can do when it's the scariest part of change, which is probably the first 2 weeks within the announcement, to maybe highlight themselves as a leader?
Thanks for that question, Marnie. I think first thing as an individual contributor, you look at what did I do really well? And then also be realistic of what am I falling short in? It is an opportunity for leadership to really assimilate the best team possible. So I think particularly what you can do is being vocal that you're positive about the change in a public forum, being on the conference calls, talking about how you're approaching it in a positive manner. Number one. I think secondarily, reaching out to other members of your team and being an advocate for leadership is speaks volumes. Not everybody is going to be on the same page about these changes. So whether it's people underneath you in your team or direct peers, can be just as powerful. And then lastly, I think one thing that I can point to in my individual case is trying to learn specifically about what is going to roll out in this change and the action items. So you're not the person that is learning about the business plan as they're rolling it out. You've done your homework and you can ask engaging questions. It helps you stand out as somebody that is very much on board with this change rather than somebody that is being drug along in the change.
I love all of those points, Maryrose. I would add to just, I've touched a lot on communication because I know the impact that's had over the course of my career. So I would include any opportunity for communication, whether that is one-on-one huddles. If you had a monthly cadence, maybe move it to biweekly. And the point of that is to be able to position and maybe even break down what the new expectations are, what the strategic plan looks like, what is the restructure, new roles and responsibility. The more that you can narrow that down, I think that would really pay back in dividends, because clarity it's key for me. The more that you can provide clarity and the more that you can tie your team into what their new roles and responsibility is as a result of that change would only add value.
I would also add, Erica, I think being realistic with yourself is really important during these time periods. Be self-aware. If you see these changes as something you're not willing to do and you're not going to be able to assimilate to the direction and the vision of leadership, that might be time to start getting out the Rolodex and looking for opportunities. I mean, one thing that stands out to me is in a merger and acquisition position. This happens quite often. You have a large organization that buys a smaller organization. Person from said smaller organization is very much used to being in a startup vibe, likes a leaner operation. You get then bought into this large organization where it's a lot more bureaucratic, a lot more red tape. Your personality may not be suited for being in a Fortune 100 company. If you know that about yourself, probably, I'm not saying jump ship immediately, but would probably be time for some reflection of, is this where I'm going to be optimized, or is my skill set and my personality better suited for a different culture?
Yeah, I agree. That's such a good point. I can think back and reflect on certain time frames of my career where I've either myself been in that same situation and or been coaching someone that is on my team, and we've either gone through a change. I'm thinking of one point, one example specifically, where there was some reevaluation of someone reassessing whether this was a good fit because of the change. And at the end of the day, I think the best thing that we could do as leaders is, if there's a opportunity that they have elsewhere and it no longer is available in the place of employment where they're at, I hate to lose a team member, but if they're going to rise to the occasion in another role, like, how do you play a part in that? How do you support that? How do you encourage that appropriately? I say that, not to lose someone on your team, but alignment is so important. If they're no longer aligned, both personally and professionally, if you can support that team member in their trajectory of their career, I find that incredibly fulfilling.
Well, this has been an absolutely incredible discussion. Thank you, ladies, both. And I'm sure our listeners picked up a lot of great tips. If you want to learn more about either Erika or Maryrose, please check out their bios in the show notes.
Thanks for having me today, Marnie. It was great to connect with you and Erika.
Likewise, this was such a great conversation. Looking forward to just the involvement of being able to lead through change. Look forward to the future podcast. Thanks, Marnie.
Thanks for listening to Connect to Develop. You can find more interviews and Marnie's Minutes on my YouTube channel at Marney Reid Presents.